So I can't roll the clip for y'all because Joe Budden will sue me. But on the Joe Budden podcast last week, we were talking, and in the midst of that, I did like a improvised 30-second breakdown of a couple of hot news stories. And the final of the three that I brought up was the fact that all of the journalists working for Al Jazeera, where I work, full disclosure, who are in Gaza, have been killed. Every single one. I was struck by it that day because one more had been killed, and I was sort of devastated by it. But I did a quick blip, and we didn't deal with it, right? I talked about it, and then Joe made a joke about sort of how to segue out of that. I think he referenced Young Thug. And then he asked Melissa Ford, one of our co-hosts, how she would transition out of it, or why she didn't engage. And she said, well, how do you transition from that? How do you pivot from that? And then we made another Young Thug kind of joke, and then we kept going. And I didn't think much of it for a few reasons, but the internet felt differently. I saw think pieces, I saw videos, I saw TikTok analysis. The two hottest things from the show last week were Emanny viciously attacking me, and this story about Gaza, and Gaza trumped everything. And I was a little struck by it. Before I get into step 2 of that, I guess what I wondered is what y'all made of it. I know you've seen the clip, and I know, Chris, you are a watcher of the show. So, maybe I'll start with you, Chris. How did you make sense of it when you saw it?
As with most things, in the moment, you're enjoying it. It's part of the general banter. It's the mode of engagement of the team there. So, I didn't think much of it, but I think isolated, right? When you take it out of the context of the show or the flow of the show or the flow of that platform, I actually got a real big lesson on media literacy because in that moment, having heard the full thing and then having witnessed it outside of context, I literally read it 2 different ways. And if I didn't have the previous experience, I would have thought I was tripping. You know what I mean? And so I think it's one of those things where depending on where you are and how you're situated, you learn to read it differently. I think a lot of the folks who saw the clip also might have just saw that section and it just seemed really awkward. And then there's also like an absence of humanity that folks in general have. You know what I mean? That's something that's so jarring that a response completely off topic might be someone's method of almost healing or in the moment psychologically dealing with the trauma of making meaning of it, right? So if you read somebody's response to something as them not wanting to be involved, that same scenario can be read as a person engaging in some sort of avoidance as a psychological strategy to not face hearing that people die. You know what I mean? So I think it's a variation of things. If you see the clip in isolation, I could see why folks was mad. It's like, yo, you don't care? And then when you watch the full scope of the thing and you know how folks engage generally, and then you start making meaning of how folks respond to things in variances of ways as a consequence of their sort of mental orientation, then,
it's different. I mean, but that's important because what you're talking about, and Emanny, you could probably speak to this better than anybody, is context, right? If you watch a clip in isolation, you don't know the context of the show. Just like you and I last week were kind of playfully joking, and I said I teased you, and then you threw something at me, and the cup spilled on me. And there were people who knew we were joking, and then there were people who were like, Marc Lamont Hill assaulted, Emanny's furious, beige rage at its worst, and I was like, well, that only makes sense if you don't pay attention to any other thing that's happened for the last hour and a half or the last 10 months that I've been there and maybe the last 10 years. One of the things that I think people might miss is how heavy stories are covered on the Joe Budden Podcast. Because heavy stuff does get covered, but how would you describe, as the insider, sort of how heavy stuff gets dealt with?
Let me just say, before I even try to cape for us, because that's essentially what people are going to think that I'm about to do, the way it was handled was wrong. The way it was treated was wrong. And there's just certain things that there's never a good segue for a joke to be put in place. It just doesn't make sense. This is something that no matter how lighthearted we want to keep the podcast, we want to transition to the next topic, it's too heavy, it's too much going on, and it's too much at risk. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of lives being lost, there is no easy segue or playful segue into a next topic coming from that. So naturally, it should have been handled the way that it should have been handled, which was with seriousness and with concern and with care. And, thankfully, Joe recognized that and he spoke about it and addressed it in that manner as well. So there's no need for me to even try to explain to people the nuances and how much we did. We're professional enough to know that at a certain point, we have to hold ourselves accountable for the mess ups. And that was a mess up.
And like you said, he acknowledged it, which I appreciated the next episode. Yeah. I thought people didn't read him as generously as they could have. And I think the context of the show warranted some generosity. In other words, like, I don't think he was saying fuck Palestine. I think he was saying this is awkward. I don't know enough about this to speak about it. And we do that about everything. Emanny and I have both told some pretty personal stuff up there that got responded to that way. So I don't think it was particular to Palestine either. But I do think that this did warrant something different. And Joe acknowledged that. Mm-hmm. And even as people were trying to say, well, it wasn't that bad, he's like, no, I'm going to hold myself accountable, which I appreciate and respect.
But I don't know, maybe you go off topic if you want. But I think that scenario really lends itself to like another type of conversation about how we generally consume media and how various forms of media sort of replicate other types of modes of engagement that may be outside of who the viewership is. And so, like, I fully respect Emanny's response. I think it's a beautiful response, and I really appreciate your description of Joe. Kind of like, I apologize, but I think it's important for us to situate for the public that there has to be a little bit more more leeway based on platform and what the structure replicates, right? So in an academic conversation, the context lends itself like pause, let's be thoughtful, let's be morose, and then because of the advent of podcasting and everybody's consuming, the nature of that dialogue is almost like how we converse with each other in really, really private owned spaces. We have the privilege to be able to bear witness to it, but the nature of that dialogue is more indicative of how we engage with each other on like at home, that it warrants an understanding of the sophistication of the context. That's all I'm saying. But I guess so it lends to a whole other conversation about media and consumption and podcasts versus news stories, and it opens up a lot, but it's where we are right now.
Well, let me ask you, is our podcast in the wrong place to talk about certain shit?
No. And
because at home we'll talk about the same. You talk about the same shit too. We would talk about a war and shorties. Like it happens.
But see, that's the thing. At home, and I want you to jump in after this. Like at home, we might do that, and on TV you have to perform a certain kind of pivot so that you don't look insensitive. At home, I'd be like, yo, that's fucked up. Yo, did you see Shorty up the street? Right. And that's just it. But if we do that on the show, you look like an ass. And so I don't know.
That's the responsibility we put on ourselves when we decide to get on a camera and say that we're going to speak and share our opinions. We know it's not simply just sharing our opinions within the confines of our private settings. We're doing this because we know a lot of people are going to hear it. And especially when we're talking to someone like you, Mark, on a platform who's well-informed. And while we might not be well-informed, if we want to actually converse with you, probably we should get a little more educated on how serious this is. I'll be honest with you. I've heard things, I watch the news and stuff, but I'm not as educated on a lot of these topics as you guys are. And the last thing I ever want to do is treat this like the normal day-to-day like podcast topic. Yeah. Even if I am still talking about it on the podcast, it still needs to be handled with a certain level of care. And the minute we put those cameras on, we have a duty to treat this the proper way, no matter how we feel about it in our own personal lives.
There's part of me that says that's why we just shouldn't cover it. Because, my thing is I'd rather just cover it here and not even think about it on another venue, because I don't know. And we see some sports all the time. Like, we'll cover sports stories, but how in depth do I want to talk about race norming in the NFL, where they were saying basically if you're black, we grade your score differently. So when we tested for CTEs, it's easier to not be liable because we're saying, well, black people's brain is a little bit, their brain don't work the same. That's something I could cover on ESPN, but that needs an in-depth analysis that's deeper. If I want to talk about steroids, if I want to talk about what to do about trans athletes, right? I mean, I could do that on SportsCenter, but it feels like SportsCenter ain't the place to do that.
Yeah, I think it is a space, and I think look, even if a response had context behind it, or even if it was the wrong response, the fact that folks who listened and watched had the opportunity in real time to witness that exchange happen, to witness the awkwardness, for the person who was in it to be like, "Ooh, that was ridiculous." Like, that's what growth looks like. So I think all platforms have to share everything. You have the gift or the curse of having a spotlight on you and make the mistakes for everybody to witness. But look at this conversation we're having now that allows us to really dig into the nuance, right? Like, I'm sure as a consequence of this experience, not just the folks in your podcast, but also the public would know that if someone talks about a bunch of lives lost, even if you feel awkward, you'd rethink you'd rethink it. Right. So we're witnessing learning in real time. And I think learning requires grace. It requires an understanding of context. And then it requires the expectation that the person who harmed moves forward to the next instance, which should happen again, right? And now you see growth. And I think that's the ultimate goal.
Gotcha. I'm gonna move on, but I just want to read some comments from people who wrote in, and thank you for your generosity. Baby K said, dismissing Palestinians' lives on a huge platform when we already have an empathy crisis in this country is dangerous biz. And then we got Anna Bathroom, who said, I understand the apprehension to address it. Doesn't make it right, but I get it. The real thing is that we understand that what is happening to Palestinians puts us all in danger. And that's where I would end it. Yeah, I don't want us to ever reinforce the narrative that we can't talk about Palestine. Part of how Palestine gets treated the way it does is because we all have bought into the idea that our lives will be ruined if we talk about it. And look, I obviously, I'm an example of someone who did take some hits for this. But on the whole, if we all talk about it, we don't have to take the hits. That's the point.
That's right.
And the idea, we have to be honest that there are people who don't want justice to prevail in any situation, and those people work hard to keep their positions as they are. It's an uphill battle to win, but we have to fight it. And so we have to have that conversation in all the places that it makes sense to have it. Anyway, I'm gonna move on to another story. Said no mention Al Sharif praised 10-7 and ties to Hamas. I'm not sure what that means. New York Yankee 718. You said $2, so I'm reading it, but I have no idea what you're talking about. He often sends things. He basically pays me to say things that are crazy, and I don't mean crazy, but that he's usually on the wrong side. If it's who I think it is, he's usually on the wrong side of the issue.
He can send a 20-piece at this point. I mean,
I think that's fair. You know what? Yeah, you know, Yankee, send a dub, or else it's a dub.